Okay, so the lecture today is going to be on the subject of pre-colonial African cities. And teaching is not a kind of finite, defined thing all the time. This topic comes up from a kind of confrontation with a student last year who said, how come we're not talking properly about African cities? Totally reasonable question to ask. And so this represents my research of other people's research. So it's very much a secondary description. And I've tried to find a way through it that doesn't treat the pre-colonial African city as something that is back then. And I think this is something we really need to consider really thoroughly, because in the context of the Rhodes Must Fall movement and all of the range of things that came up around decolonisation, one of the conversations that was had was really around Africanisation of the curriculum. Now, if you pushed a bit harder and you talked to people about what that meant, people started to talk about circular rondavels, etc. And so you realise suddenly that there's an interesting take here where, what are we going back? Are we going forward? How are we working with what's now versus what was, what's contemporary, what's old? And I think this is a really important point to start from and recognises something that's happening in anthropology. There's a guy called Fabian who has this thing he calls from anthropology, which is he calls the denial of, it's a very annoying term, denial of co-eval, like co-evolution. And what he noticed was that his students were starting to talk to people that they were meeting in the field as if they were from a different time period than they were. So they'd be talking to people who are in the Amazon now like they were in the Amazon 1,000 years ago. But in actual fact, people were contemporary with each other. So in other words, they were searching for a kind of authenticity in the past rather than recognising that we live in a hybrid condition right now. And so I've been to the Amazon, and one of the things that I found interesting there was finding the intersection between what you might have called traditional Amazon culture and Western culture. There's a very blurry boundary, and I mean the term that happens in Latin America, and also a term that I know comes up in a lot of Brazilian and also Angola, is this idea of mestizo culture, which is that culture is actually a hybrid between the colonizer and the colonized, located in modernity. So I just want you to keep that in your head, because when I'm talking about old things, I am talking a little bit about history, but I'm trying to ultimately get to a point where I force an adjacency between the present and land practices of the recent past and potentially current land practices. And the basic thesis that I'm going to make, and I'll put it out front straight away, are around the idea of whether we occupy the landscape or whether the whole landscape of the world is a city. And so in a way, that's around the idea of urbanisation versus the idea of sort of planetary urbanism, which is that the world is first and foremost a landscape system on a global scale in which humans and cities form a part, versus the view that the whole place is urbanised. Now, those are not different. It's more that ecological thinking is a way of describing the world. And so it also is a way of describing the city. And if we don't describe the city ecologically, then we're in real trouble. And also one of the things we can learn, and I don't mean this in a David Suzuki kind of we can learn everything by going into the past way, but one thing we can learn from some of the ways of occupying landscape from other cultures that have occupied landscape differently might help us solve some current environmental issues, but they do so in a way that undermines the role of capital, undermines the role of property, messes with political systems like capitalism. Okay, let's jump in. So, you know, I'm an Aussie. I don't really know that much about Africa and South Africa, and I know there's this great website called Africa is a Country, which is, you know, talks about the idea that everyone just seems to think that Africa is just both a continent and a country at the same time. I don't think that. But I do think we have to look, and first and foremost as a landscape architect, I think we have to look at the way that the climatology, the way the geomorphology, the way the soils and the vegetation of the continent operate, and start to see cities and regions in relationship to that. And so obviously what we can see if we move from that relief map with vegetation down to this map of vegetation, moving into a sort of space that I am much more comfortable, we see things that and I don't know why they made rainforest red, but anyway, that's interesting. We can see some things quite interesting that we must remember because they will come back and inform how we understand the pre-colonial African city. So obviously we're down here. I don't know how this also became described as rainforest. Okay. But nonetheless, we know that we are actually in this sort of the edge of a semi-desert situation. We know we have a lot of savanna and bushland thickets going through the middle. We know that we also have these woodlands through here in the sort of Zimbabwe Great Lakes region, moving into the rainforests, moving into a graduation into desert, etc., and semi-desertification. Now, with that in mind, it's no surprise that when you look at the pre-colonial African city, you can really quite clearly see some of those divisions play out in how the city is formed. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump between a few different things. Now, some of this is probably stuff, I would imagine you get taught this in high school. Do you get taught this in high school in South Africa? About, sorry? So I don't know it. So this is me being a high school student, And so if we look first of all at this map, I think, which is also really, really important, what we can understand also is language formation in Africa. Now, I recognise that there is a really politicised aspect to this conversation that I've read about in relationship to apartheid, where in actual fact the description of this idea of Bantu languages and Bantu people and Bantu stands was used as a political tool during the apartheid regime. So I'm not talking about that, I'm talking about language movement. And it relates a lot to the settlement patterns that were happening around the area. Now obviously in the north of the Sahara we're in a situation where the main sort of formation of languages, a lot of which is based around aspects of the introduction and relationship of Islam. A lot of the languages that come through from the rainforest areas and move south into South Africa are the Bantu languages, which relate to cattle herding, and then we have the Khoi and San languages around here. Now, again, I won't pretend there's people who've done this in more depth than I will, but I think it's really interesting when we look at these kind of images here. I think it's interesting to try to look at the pre-colonial empires as they stood in that period of pre-colonisation. But first off, it's really worth looking at the fact that pre-colonisation, what is that point? What is the point we talk about colonisation or not colonisation? So, in a way, we have to start to think a bit broader than simply European colonisation, because the development of cities in Africa was tied to earlier processes around slave trading prior to Western colonisation as well. And so, for example, if we look at the medieval slave trade in Africa, what we see is a really clear passage between the rainforest country through here, trading, slaves being collected from the rainforest country and then traded either to the Mediterranean, through Sudan and Chad, etc., or moving across through Mali into the what's known as the Sahel area, and then traded off the coast, etc. And so with that in mind, it's interesting to note how the river of the Congo, etc., was a corridor by which traders from this coast made their way to this coast, whereas obviously the process from Europe was very much based around slave trading from this coast across to South America and North America, but again was operating through similar networks. And so the colonial slave networks were matching, but for the other direction, the previous Arab slave networks. I mean, there's some people, and I don't know how serious or how dodgy this is, but there's some discussion around the idea that slavery was more like indenturedness in the Islamic slave trading, which is more like people actually got bought out for a certain period and it was a way of bringing money back. And I don't know about that, but I think you have to see that in relation to each other. So if we look at the sort of kingdoms that we sort of see in Africa at this time, the main ones that I think we'll talk about is that we'll talk a little bit about Benin, we'll talk a little bit about the Aksum over here and Ethiopia, and then we'll move down to talk about Great Zimbabwe, simply because it's close, right? And so this is where I'm saying I'm totally treating things as a city. Now, if we, as cities. So if we start with probably one of the oldest, we go to Aksum. And Aksum is in Ethiopia, and Ethiopia is one of the oldest kingdoms. You know, you would have said that Nubia is also an extremely old kingdom. Nubia, you know, was some of the earliest black people that ended up in Europe and are recorded in Rome and are recorded in England during the Roman Empire as free people were generally people from Nubia in Sudan, moving through into Africa, into Egypt. But also we have Aksum as a very old empire. Now, Ethiopia, for the landscape students and the urban design students are doing a trip to Ethiopia, and we'll be going to Aksum on on a field trip this year. For the landscape students next year, we're going to be going to Ghana. But you'll see how this here. Does anybody know what this drawing is or what this image is? From really bad resolution. Yeah? No? So basically, this is an X-ray. So, it tells you something about where you find out about cities like this now. Most of the information coming out of about cities here is coming through archaeology, and which is also, so you're really relying upon a number of sources, such as, in a contemporary sense, you're relying upon archaeological sources who are utilising material evidence to try to demonstrate certain things about cities. From that, you're looking at social science readings of archaeological evidence. As well as that, you're looking at colonial records of people describing what they found. And to some extent, you're looking at oral histories, but many of those, because oral history is much more viral, it's much more adaptable, it's much more flexible. Oral histories in a current scientific sense are hard to rely upon for things once you get past 200 or 300 years. And so this, on the other hand, is where a lot of stuff is coming from, is very advanced techniques like X-rays. And so Aksum was a major empire. Ethiopia also, it should be recognised, is the only country in Africa that was not colonised. And so Ethiopia is, very proud of that fact. And also, as a Christian country, if you'll remember in Acts, a eunuch is met during the travels and is converted and goes back to Ethiopia, the land of the Queen of Sheba, and then actually that becomes first church. And so Ethiopia is a very old Christian country. This is pre-Christian, obviously. Now, on that coast, staying on that coast here, which is this coast, we can see the sort of city of Timbuktu in Mali. Now, even though this is right over on this side of the continent, interestingly, its main relationship and knowledge to the world is via the routes through from the Mediterranean, through Egypt, into the Nubian Empire and across to Timbuktu, and then through the networks that come through here to it. So even though it's actually on this side of the country, it's actually on this side of the country because it's part of the Sahel slave trade routes. Now, when we see it, this is, these are sort of old drawings of it. We see cities that are very much Muslim cities in a sense. Well, if we're looking at it, next week, Guy Briggs will talk about the grid. And the grid is one of the basic methods of describing a city, and it's cross-cultural, and lots of cities use it. Lots of cultures have used the grid to organise things. It's sort of democratic, it's infrastructural, it offers measurement in some sort of way, it has clearly defined public and private spaces. It separates land tenure quite nicely. And so obviously Timbuktu was a very old slaving city, and not just a slaving city, it was a trading city through also all of the goods that were coming out of the Congo, and those kind of places were then heading to Timbuktu and heading across to the Arab trading world. And obviously another thing that's really common you'll see is interior courtyards in the buildings. And so that type of typology of exterior public space, internalised private space, light wells, the public as an outside of private interior is something you'll see from the Sahel cities. Now, if we compare that to what's happening on the other coasts, we see some influence. Now, obviously, in the 12th century, there's a series of major civilizations. Benin City in Nigeria is incredibly important city, obviously still around and actually entirely disappeared. So we see, on the one hand, two contradictory images here. We see this image as this is the Great Wall of Benin, which was, the Guinness Book of Records regards this as the biggest wall ever made, even though you'd have to think the Great Wall of China was bigger. But and so this is the Great Wall of Benin City, and then one would have to assume this is the interior of that city. Now, Benin City is, as I say, still around, but the actual leftover remnants of it are now so buried under the city they're almost entirely invisible. And the same is true of this city, Kumasi, which is, I think it's definitely the university town, and I don't know whether it's the capital of Ghana, but Kumasi has continued to be an important city, and and you'll see that there's one thing I want you to pick up here, which is there's a dynamic relationship between a kind of circular form and also the rectangular form. And I think it's you can pretty much say that this form is here, but it's worth recognising that even though Kumasi, can you close that for me just a bit? Even though Kumasi is a 12th century city, in actual fact, its boom was in the 16th and 17th century. So if things are, would seem to be nicely separated, we could start to make a case here that this is a grid city that is part of the Bantu language expansion, but then we'd have to accept that also there would be no cross-contamination, so to speak, between other cultures and other types of urbanism. Now, if Timbuktu is the main trading location through to the east coast, then in actual fact you have to assume that there might be feedback between those cities that were coming from the Sahel and developing in the Sahel and moving into Kumasi. Now, this is the gold stool, and obviously, this was the Gold Coast, and these places along here were the Gold Coast, and so in actual fact, the export of gold was a major part, as well as of slaves and salt, etc. Now, if we just put that aside for a moment, we then want to move to one of the places which I think is sort of, if I just geographically look where we are on this thing and say, what is the main city and what is the closest city? We look at the Great Zimbabwe Empire is the closest, technically. And people have different sorts of versions of what the African city should be. Now, I've given you in this reading, I gave you the descriptions from this woman whose name I really cannot pronounce, Kokiri Valerie. Very amazing person. She really talks about 4 types of African cities in that reading. And they are these ancient cities such as Great Zimbabwe, and she puts that into this model of the ancient cities. Then she talks about cities from contact with Islam, which is the Sahel cities, like these cities through here. Then Portuguese and European cities, and then finally colonial cities. And so she was a person who advocates for African cities. And so if you consider that she disagrees with this guy O'Connor, who gives a much broader typology, which is 6 types: indigenous cities, which is the Yoruba in Nigeria; Muslim cities, which is a lot of which are the ports along this coast; colonial cities like Libreville; European cities like Nairobi; twin cities and hybrid cities. But, nonetheless, what I want to move on to, let's just make a thought experiment here. And let's talk about Great Zimbabwe. And when I'm talking about a thought experiment, the thought experiment I want you to think about is Great Zimbabwe a city? And does it matter if it's a city? Now, it's interesting because the CCV, as I call her, thinks it is a city and makes an argument that it is a city. And a lot of other people do also make that argument. I think it's important to recognise also that a lot of the ways of occupying landscape and a lot of the reasons why they may not be regarded as cities is because they're tied to how their landscapes operate. So if we think about the city as, in a way, a process of destruction of context, a process of wiping out a place to make a new city, in a way you can argue that the city is a process of separating from the landscape. Because almost all of the definitions of what a city is actually come back to an idea that is about trade and separation. And so if we talk about, for instance, the definitions that are being utilised by a range of people, the ones that would be most obvious is that a city is somewhere where people are being fed, not based exclusively on agriculture. It's the existence of specialised craft and the division of labour, which is to say there are craftspeople, there are religious leaders, there are kings, so there's a division of labour. And then that there's a monumental architectural aspect to it. This is a really important idea and one that I'm quite suspicious of. The reason I'm suspicious of it is, of course, then we go down the line that the only things that count as cities are those things that left a mark made of stone. And if we think about that, then we're regarding cities as always being about permanence. If we think about that and we think about the environmental problems we're having now, it's the fact that things get bigger and bigger, their fixedness causes more and more problems, their lack of flexibility causes more and more problems. And so if we associate the city with endless growth, endless endurance, minimal change over time, we're also associating it with potentially environmental destruction. If you look at in the world, we look at, for instance, the birth of agriculture in the US and the expansion of corn by the Navajo people in the US, we discovered that as soon as they began to grow corn, they began to urbanise. Because they began to trade, they began to create surpluses. As soon as there's a surplus, they can have a division of labour. I pay you X much corn to get X. Somebody has more corn than somebody else, therefore they have people working for somebody else. But more than that, when environmental change occurs, it can be catastrophic. And so if you look at a lot of the Pueblo cities in North America, you discover that at other periods of global warming and El Nino particularly, and La Nina, which were the measured by the Southern Oscillation Index, which is where heat changes and where droughts happen, a number of cities were abandoned in America just as they'd urbanised because they were relying upon a crop that disappeared. And so the relationship between agriculture and the city is sometimes problematic. It's like where we are now. And this is something I'll go to at the end of the lecture. Now, if we also talk here quickly, I'm going to make a side movement quickly to something that's known as the CCP. And the CCP is the Central Cattle Pattern. Now again, this is like a wormhole I fell down while I was preparing for this lecture. I'd never heard of the CCP before. So the CCP is a diagram. and it's also a town plan. And so something that the intersection between social science and archaeology has been working on. And there's a lot of contestation around this guy Huffman and the CCP. And so the main things to look at in this diagram is that there is a central court or a buyer, that there is a leader, that there is a division between male spaces and female spaces often. There's a hierarchy expressed around the edges, and that there is a external edge to it. Now, if we look at that pattern, and the argument that many people make is that we're looking at this type of configuration at Great Zimbabwe, what we're seeing is an urbanisation of the central cattle pattern. And the central, in the case that Huffman makes, which some people argue with, so I'm not going to advocate for it, but the case that he makes is that out of this movement through here, that the formation of the central cattle pattern comes out of housing structures that were operating in here, and as the Bantu language and cultural expansion occurred between 500 and 1000 AD, down here, effectively the central cattle pattern becomes established as tied to the Bantu nations of their different sorts. And so that's the argument that Huffman makes. And so in a way, when we're talking about if the Great Zimbabwe is actually a city, which many argue it is, whether they argue it just because they want to have an example of a city or whether or not, or how they argue it, nonetheless, the central cattle pattern is tied to it. So obviously in the most basic order it's this diagram, but obviously at other points that diagram becomes much more complex. And so one of the things that I really want to look at and talk about here is that there is a paradigm difference between a model of city organised like this and a model of city that is organised like this. So that in a way the Sahel city, as a grid city tied to Islam with its particular relationships between men, women, inside, outside, family structure, faith, etc., is a fundamental difference to the CCP situation, which is actually around not simply the circle, but in a way a change of land tenure. There is a sense that this configuration has a clear ownership pattern to it, whereas this here has a kinship-based structure to it at its most basic. And so obviously those sort of relations operate differently. Also, and this is for me an incredibly important thing, is that in the middle of this configuration there be cows. And so here is our President Cyril Ramaphosa, yay! And he is here with his cattle, and so I'm sure you all know that he's a massive cattle fan, and Nguni cattle is something he collects, and he's got this very beautiful book on Nguni cattle that he produced with a photographer. And so when you think about that, you have to think about the fact that we have a city of trade like this, and then we have a city of pasture like this. And so what happens obviously is that during this period, the cattle that are owned by the tribe move to the central buyer at night. And so they're being protected. Now obviously they're being protected, the most basic way of saying that they're being protected is they might be being protected from theft. But what's really interesting for me is they're being protected also from predation, which is that there's a landscape out there of which the settlement is in a defensive position in relation to lions and a whole range of other animals that are in that landscape. These cities, if they are cities, are occupying a landscape in a different way to the way that the trade city is operating in a landscape. This is a fundamentally, to some extent, a denatured city based around relations of other places, moving things to this place, distribution outwards, the agglomeration of wealth, grow a story, buy the next block, to one which is about the management of cattle. Now, it's easy to think that this is, in a way, it's like everyone who does an architecture project in a national park is automatically going to do something that's in that genre, right? I mean, it's like if you did this at studio, you would get kicked out, basically, And so, because it would be seen to be this vernacular thing. Africa's like it was. No, it's not. It's different to it now. But at the same time, here is the Women's Opportunity Centre in Rwanda, designed by a sort of leading American aid architect. What's the configuration? It's the central cattle pattern. A series of rondavels around a central buyer, etc., etc. And so the persistence, what is Nkandla? Nkandla is the same. So it's a configuration. You drive to the Western Cape, you'll see variations of it. And so it's here. How is it that Great Zimbabwe, which uses the central cattle pattern, could be an example of a city, but these types of configurations are not? And it comes back to this ideas around permanence and that relationship to landscape. Now I'm going to go on a little diversion, and I've got my eye on time here as well. You need 40 minutes as well, right? Yeah. And so what I want to talk about quickly is I'm going to flash forward a little bit and go back to this question of what you might call, cultural relativism. So in the 19th century, and, obviously the first thing to say is obviously the, expansion out of Africa produced all people all over the world. So you can't really talk about colonisation as a one-directional process. We have to talk about colonisation as a process with a different time interval to it. And so colonisation occurred from movement from people through Africa, through Asia, split off into Europe, across Asia, across America, across Russia, across America, down to the bottom of South America, and then another expansion later on across also at the same time across into Australia. Rising sea levels, climate change, isolating populations, different species of people. So when we look at the idea of, Africa was colonised, we have to remember Africa colonised first, probably. Now, in the discourse of the city, there's this thing I would call the subject. And the subject is you when you walk down the street, but it's not me when I work as an urban designer, or you when you work as an urban designer. The subject is the person using a public space. The subject is the person using a house. The subject is somebody who we create for the purpose of having someone to do something with, to study, etc. And we always use the subject. We might call them the user. We might call them a statistic. We might call them the sample. But all the time we create subjects whenever we practice these days in relationship to science or in relationship to policy. And so this making of the subject, this othering process, is fundamental also to cities. And so I've got three images here. One is this Death of the Noble Savage. This one is an image of a flaneur in Paris in the 19th century. And this one is a person in a garden of Le Corbusier's modernist city. Now, the reason I put all three of these together is each of them at different times of the 20th century has been called, or the 19th and 20th century. That door is going to drive me absolutely bananas. Can someone pull this sliding door here across? Because next time I'll go out there and I'll start banging my head against it, going dunga, 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 dunga. But so the noble savage was a way of positioning Indigenous people and othering them in such a way that they could be talked about in this other way. And when I say this othering way, I mean it relegates people to archaeology, it relegates them to anthropology, it relegates people outside of one's lived experience and tries to characterise them and universalise them. And in a way, the central cattle pattern is for the noble savage. It's not for now, right? It's not for now. That's your architectural teachers would tell you the same thing. It's not for now. We don't do that anymore. It's corny. Now, in the 19th century, though, the flaneur, do you talk about flaneurs as well? But the flaneur is basically the urban dweller, modern urban dweller who goes from cafe to cafe, writing in their notebook. They're a dandy, they're wandering around, living the urban life. And so the city was designed around these promenading sort of flaneurs in the same sort of way. A positive image as compared to the noble savage, which was like a sad image because, oh dear, they have to pass because their time has passed, etc., etc. Now, here in modernist architecture, we also have the noble savage because the way that the landscape was designed was essentially that the buildings were culture and the landscape was nature. And to be in the landscape was to be in nature, to go back to your roots as an organism, to experience the primeval, etc. It's again around this idea of the subject. But I want to just talk about two images here quite quickly that are important, I think. So here is an informal settlement on the edges of Paris in the 19th century. And here is Europe in Guguletu in about 2008. And so the point I want to make is that informality has been a part of urbanisation forever. We can't actually talk about this idea that the city is only a city when it's built because urban informality has been a process of flux by which cities changed and transformed. Original cities in Africa and original cities in Europe were all originally set up with different levels of informality and different levels of settlement. And so when we're talking about informality and change, like it's a condition that is a problem in the developing world, we're only talking about a difference of 100 years or 100 years plus. If we're in Calais, we've got an informal settlement, the jungle, which is in Calais, which is made up of refugees at the moment. And so informality is not a past or a present process. Now, if we put these together, here this is in Mali, not one of our Sahel cities here. We can see here that this is a Malian city, which is variations around the central cattle pattern. Right? We can see that that's an urbanisation of the central cattle pattern because we can see the hierarchy in relationship to entries. We can see the central kraal. We recognise the type, and in a way that's an informal settlement in a sense. If formality is simply made of stone, made of masonry, has permanence. What's this happening here? This is all about time and solidity and change. Now, quickly, to talk about a couple of things in paradigms that I want you guys to think about in relationship to these images. So this is from a guy called Colin Rowe. You'll hear more about him and Fred Coetta. And there's two paradigms that split down urban thinking. And they really revolve around the relationship between figure and ground. And so what we're talking about is figure is literally object. Here is a figure. This is an object, we look at it. When programming occurs, it's object-orientated. When we think, it's object-orientated. First, create a thing, then create a subdivision. Each of the subdivisions, another thing. We think in an object-based way. Now, interestingly, in urban thinking, there is a point at which the city as a series of objects becomes agglomerated to the point where the city is both one single object and we're moving through fissures and gaps in the object of the city. This is the European city. Now, it's obviously we can see traces of informality and change. Like this, if you went to the informals, let's just look a little bit here. If I show you that configuration there, we'll see that a proper grid was probably never put down here. Probably what happened was there was a formalisation of settlement pattern, of infrastructure over time, a tweaking and moving of edges to create a pattern. It's different to the grid thinking. On the other hand, if I go to Guguletu now, and we look at Guguletu, come on, how hard can it be? we can see exactly the same configurations happening here. So let's not assume that we're talking about a process that only happens in the developed world. Now, as well as that, the main thing I wanted to talk about was that this is, in a way, what you would call fabric. These both are drawings of urban morphology. But this is one is where the city is a continuous field, and this is one during modernism where objects sit in the field. And so the city is made up of more space than object, and the other one is where there is more object than space. Urban design wants to do that. Contemporary development processes want to do that, because these are based around demarcation of property boundaries. They are based around yield, but nonetheless, they're also, in a way, the model of the building as something that's looked at, that's something that's moved around, versus the city as a continuous surface in which we move through. And if we think about it dumbly in relationship to these, on the one hand, we're talking about here, that we're talking about something in a landscape, versus this is both something in a landscape as well as a totality of things. If we look at these diagrams here, we can start to imagine the central cattle pattern coalescing into an urban mass, not so different from this, where it's about spacing and it's about relationship to landscape. Now, obviously, that model, even though it may seem past of the central cattle pattern, is in fact highly still present. Is this a kraal in the middle here? Are these all places arranged around this? Is this cul-de-sac the central cattle pattern? Probably not, but I think it's an interesting question that what is the relationship between these ideas about the old and the new? What is happening in these things? Suburbia is a classic example of a hut or an object or a villa in a landscape. That's the model that it wants to have. But this is the model that we know we need to have if we want to be able to operate sustainably with our population sizes. Now I'm going to jump back to something else and look at something and discuss something quite interesting, which is that... we'll finish in 10 minutes. 5 minutes?
10:30 now
we have this to...
10:30.
We do, yes. So this diagram is... So if we looked at that there, that is pretty much... Well, it's a bit of the opposite of the central cattle pattern, but that is nonetheless a variant of the central cattle pattern. But that is actually a drawing from the colonial period. Both of these are drawings from the colonial period of Khoi inhabitation in Cape Town. And so, interestingly, linguistically, we look at this map over here, this linguistic map that I talked about before, we can see that linguistically, Khoi and Khoisan language formations are actually sitting within a larger Bantu language formation cultural background. Now, if we accept the migration came from here into this part of Africa, then it's an interesting thing that migration is tied to, where is he? Cyril, there we go, is tied to Nguni cattle. Now, if we look at what was here, what these cattle look like, what do we see? We see Nguni cattle. And so Nguni cattle were part of the migration by Bantu people into this part of the world. And so we can immediately potentially see a blurring between, did this urban type come into South Africa via the Bantu expansion? Was it traded and observed with Khoisan people? Were Khoisan people in the middle of a transition from a hunter-gatherer background into a more urbanised form at the time when that happened? Now, this diagram here I think is important to look at, because when we're talking about the Khoisan, what we're talking about is something called transhumanance. And what that refers to is the idea that people move according to climatic patterns in relationship to vegetation conditions, in relationship to stock feed. So in other words, transhumanance is that people will move to new grasslands with their communities as the seasons change, and they will move back. And so a lot of the time, that's still a large part of the world. Like, transhumanance is probably, in population terms, It's a big part, for instance, of the entire steppes of Russia. There's large parts of Africa that still operate in the savanna in relationship to transhumance. But really what we're looking at is an interesting relationship between the movement of animals, the creation of settlements, the utilisation of environments, the way the environments interact back onto the settlements. And I find an interesting thing in terms of this idea about permanence, because in actual fact, this situation, the central cattle pattern, was also very much based around a similar idea, which is that cattle move out and then at night they move back in. They're operating within that same sort of paradigm. The difference is, and they know that there were often other camps that were utilised at different times of the year. So what we're really potentially seeing in Great Zimbabwe is one of the transhumant camps becoming a city as trade of gold largely is starting to interact with the Sahel networks trading onto the coast of Mozambique. And so we're seeing a kind of a transformation from movement systems of urbanisation to solidification of those systems interacting with other trade networks that are pre-colonial into a solidification and happening. And then we're potentially seeing the same thing happen down here. Now, what stopped the Khoi and destroyed their nations at this particular point of time is the transhumance that they were operating within was where they were moving small distances to water holes. And the first thing the Dutch did is that they established their permanent dwellings at the water points. So if you were over here and I set up a permanent settlement here, I'm happy to stay over there until a drought starts to dry up my water hole. And I know that because in my oral history of my community, I know that when that one dries up, we always go over to place Y to get water with so we move our cattle, we potentially leave our camp for next time, we move across to here, but somebody's now created a permanent dwelling here and I can't access my water supply. Increasingly, we're watching a chess game, less and less water supply, suddenly no water, cattle population fails, indentured servitude of the people who are controlling the water supply. And so I suppose what I'm trying to show is that this relationship between landscape, settlement, trade, solidification is a kind of a time process that was ongoing. And also, and I suppose importantly for me and where I want to move towards the end of this presentation, is to say, if I go back to something that I know about more and I'm discovering more about in relationship to Australia, when the Indigenous people of Australia were observed hunting kangaroo by the English when they arrived. Well, let's step back. When the English first arrived in Australia, they were very excited by the fact that the landscape looked like the best taste in English public parks and landscapes. It was because there was lots of grass, there was animals in it, noble savages to look at, there was trees, but it was very open. And so it was one of the real things they talked about was this land is the most beautiful parkland. It's just like the best gardens in the UK. But what they didn't realise, apart from some astute observers, was that Aboriginal people were utilising fire to burn the landscape in relationship to cycles of rain, such as these kind of cycles, to build up the numbers of kangaroo for hunting. So they were practicing fire stick agriculture in their landscape, moving around. They were creating a farmland-looking landscape, an ornamental farm, through the process of their actions of burning and building up stock. And so the landscape condition arose from activities, not so different to the way that the Khoi were creating, putting their cattle inside the kraal and the central cattle pattern, the way that they were separated from predators, the way that settlements moved. And so what I'm sort of getting at here is something that can be shown quite nicely in this favourite image of mine of Rossi's, is how, for example, over periods of time, the form of something in the landscape over the history of cities changes from a Roman theatre through to a medieval walled. The wall gets reappropriated to be a medieval fortification against the barbarians, to eventually becoming part of the pattern of the city. And so these are there's a time process, a morphological process that makes cities. Now, finally, what I'm going to end with is to say what we're faced with and what these methods of urbanisation, which is to treat urbanisation as a time-based issue, to treat it as something with different levels of permanence, to treat it as something that's about flows of resources as adaptations to environmental circumstance. This is the Mississippi. Now, these are all of the different paths that this section of the Mississippi had over a particular period of time. Now here, if we zoom in further, here are some allotments that the colonists took of the Mississippi. Now what happens when a flood occurs and the Mississippi moves? You lose half of your lot. Who wins? You or the Mississippi? The Mississippi. What's the thing to do? Stop the Mississippi moving so my land boundary can be fixed. What happens when you do that? You end up with devastating environmental effects in New Orleans. So what we're really also looking at here is the problem which happens when land tenure systems, land ownership systems, the basis of our society, hits up against natural systems that really don't care but are now being influenced by the urban systems. And there will always be a conflict between land ownership and landscape systems. There's always going to be this conflict. It's interesting to think about what happens, like when we talk about land tenure, what's another form of land tenure? Well, strata title, a flat. I don't own the whole building, I own part of the building and I own my flat. I rent my flat out for a few months. I buy and sell it. Time is part of land tenure as well. You own the land for a certain period of time, so you sell it to somebody else, but the land actually will always do what the land wants to do when you turn the volume up under geology. And this, by the way, is a temporary settlement called Burning Man, and this is the central cattle pattern made of recreational vehicles at Burning Man. Okay, let's just